Hello, and welcome to another edition of our podcast on all things recycling. Recycle, don't be a waster. Today, we want to cover the idea or the topic that the idea of a waste problem or the major issues we face with waste and recycling. I suppose we look at the concept that these are a modern creation. They are an issue that people did not have even in relatively recent times. And I will argue in this podcast that fundamentally the entire problem with recycling, the entire problem with waste, is probably much more recent than we expect. And it's fundamentally tied to A, a consumer culture, a throwaway culture, and B, the prevalence of plastic. So that's the proposition I will discuss today, and we'll get straight into it. Anywhere you read the press, you watch television, you are aware that we have a recycling crisis. We find it harder and harder to recycle and get rid of and dispose of all the waste that we produce. And, we have landfills, we have the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, we have increasing waste and recycling issues seemingly everywhere. We question on these podcasts and elsewhere, should we incinerate? How can we build new recycling facilities? But, if we even look back in relatively recent times, let's go back to, the invention of the landfill. People are often surprised that landfills are a reasonably recent invention. I think most evidence suggests that landfills started predominantly in North America and England towards the end of probably the 1800s. And in many ways, they were a solution for a problem. They were not actually developed primarily to get rid of waste. They were primarily developed or invented as a new technology to fill in land, hence the word landfill. They were used primarily to fill in old mine shafts in the north of England, outside towns, and also in some of the coal mining areas like in Pennsylvania in the United States, whereby once a coal seam or whatever mining it was had been exhausted, there was a large hole in the ground left, which was unsightly and B, dangerous, and so filling it in was seen as a great idea, and filling it up with waste filled up that hole. It was only in later times when then waste increased and increased that we had to go and find more and more facilities for landfills. If this is the scenario, you might be asking, well, what happened before this? Why did we not need landfills before this invention? Fundamentally, the reason is we just did not produce as a society, or as in the various societies in the various countries, we just did not produce that much waste. We were very much, I suppose, from a financial perspective and income perspective, most people in recorded history were not as wealthy as we are today. We didn't consume as many goods. And also it was much more of a mend and make do society. People, you darned socks, you reused products, and we'll go through the examples of this to demonstrate. But we weren't, once something was consumed or used, it wasn't just chucked on the scrap heap. And things were generally designed to be much more long-lasting. And you can see this in any aspect of life. So, if you look at, say, let's just take an average, an example here from, say, the 1800s. A small house, it doesn't matter where it was. Food waste, there would have been very little food waste, as food was a hard come by product, and you were feeding bigger families. People consumed the food they had, and if they didn't finish that food off, it generally would have been fed to an animal, whether a pet, a dog, or a domestic animal such as hens, a cow, whatever it was, goats, whatever it would have been, pigs. The food would have been utilized to feed up that livestock. So fundamentally, there would have been virtually no food waste. Stuff like timber, wood, obviously it would have been burned for heating. So again, no waste. Concepts such as the rag and bone man, who would have been in most developed towns, who would have gone around and collected items for recycling, such as brass, tin, metals, cloth, anything like that could be used and recycled would have been taken. Virtually none of it would have been thrown out. It would have been reused, recycled in quite a manual manner, but it nearly all would have been used. And when you look into that, there just wasn't that much waste produced. We also probably lived in a society where items and materials were built for the long term. We didn't have this concept of every year getting a new football shirt, every year getting a new product. The new iPhone comes out. When people bought items, they were designed to last for a long period of time. The quality of manufacture, the long-lasting aspects. If you bought a table, it was designed to last forever and multiple generations. There was no concept that you would pop down to IKEA and buy a new one to fit your new wallpaper. That concept, outside potentially of the very, very wealthy, which was a very small percentage of society, that concept did not really exist. So the sheer production of waste, there virtually was none. And until the invention of plastic and the widespread introduction and usage of plastic, which, for the purpose of simplicity, let's argue, really kicked off from, say, the 1920s, 1930s, and became more and more widespread in the post-Second World War period. When those items were produced, that created lots of waste that fundamentally was thrown away, could not be readily reused by people, and that created an ongoing waste problem and also of materials that do not naturally break down quickly in the natural environment. And so obviously they stockpile and build up in the natural environment and cause horrific scenarios such as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So I suppose I think that really is the answer. I would really tie it back to two issues: the introduction of plastic and the introduction of an increased consumer society, whereby consumerism, is pushed through television, through marketing, and people are constantly buying the latest, the greatest. Car manufacturing. I think even back to the early eras of the car industry, whereby the concept that you get a new model that would come out each year, that was an innovation. Even items, and I think we touched on a conspiracy theory in one of the older episodes of this podcast. There is a conspiracy theory called planned obsolescence. It's a quite interesting one, that supposedly when items were invented back, say, early 1900s, they were designed to last. And there are many examples of this, such as, I think there's still a light bulb burning in somewhere in California in a fire station, a light bulb burning that was put into the roof back almost 100 years ago. But when it was developed, they were designed to last pretty much forever. There's this conspiracy theory that through planned obsolescence, now items are designed to stop working, and so you have to buy a new one. That concept, you can even see it in, I suppose, Western, when we talk about the old Soviet bloc, they made products to last a long time also. So people are still using Soviet-era refrigerators in countries like Russia, etc., whereas the Western ones which might have had higher specs, etc., but they tend to break down and create huge amounts of e-waste and other waste. So, we have this problem that we've created for ourselves. But if we look, and in our podcast, we often cover how do we get rid of them, how do we, recycle them, how do we deal with these problems. But fundamentally, what causes the problem? The problems are caused by mass consumerism, aligned with a throwaway culture. And secondly, the very tough conundrum and problems presented by the usage of plastic. If you strip away those two issues, particularly plastic, the waste problems that we face will dwindle, will become much, much smaller, much more addressable. But for some reason, we do not want to talk about these problems. Society is very keen on, hiding away from the real problems, the real reasons for problems. We tend to like to hide the symptoms and not really treat the actual causes. But until we really look at what's causing these longer term issues, we will continue to have this problem. And prevention is always better than cure. So, I think you'll get the gist that over the course of these podcasts, we tend to argue for a reduction, reducing the usage of plastics whenever possible, and certainly single-use or throwaway plastics. realistically, we're not going to go back to the society of the 1800s or 1900s, which clearly had also significant issues, significant poverty, and increased consumption clearly helps people and gives people better lives in many regards. So we're not arguing for that, but what we are arguing for is a sensible recognition of the problems that our choices make. And when we look at, mass consumption, it is not a guilt-free pleasure in many regards. So, we'll leave it there today. And again, of course, I'd be interested in hearing your questions, your comments. So, subscribe, rate and review us, of course, also on the platforms you listen to. And have a great day. So recycle, don't be a waster.